Thank you very much. So I'll start with that first. What I learned from Dr. ElMasry and what I appreciate. What I appreciate is that he comes from a place of deep faith and commitment to his religion. And so I understand where he's coming from completely. And so I admire that. And I also come from a deep faith commitment as well. And that's why today what we've really witnessed are two approaches to Islam. On the one hand, you have what can be called conservative traditionalism. Again, as a practicing Muslim who strives to be devout in my practice, I sympathize with this trend of thought. However, my academic study in Islamic studies has made me realize that this is not a tenable worldview anymore due to any number of factors, including its inability or unwillingness to embrace the latest historical scholarship and critically engage with it. As such, it is built on false narratives, wishful thinking, and special pleading. Quite simply, it sustains itself today by refusing to transparently engage with critical scholarship. And when it does, I think its shortcomings become readily apparent and exposed for all to see. The alternative approach I have put forward today as an Islamic liberal theologian is one that accepts the historical critical perspective and the latest historical scholarship. This allows us to peer behind the tradition to recover as much as possible the original teachings of the Prophet Muhammad as expressed in the Quran, just like we expect Christians to do when it comes to the historical Jesus. And we mock them when they follow verses that we know not to go back to him and prove the Trinity. For me, this endeavor is a pious one. And what I find after this process is something much more beautiful and God-inspired than the layers of tradition that have obfuscated it. This does not mean tradition is useless. This does not mean that our scholars are useless or stupid or dumb. Far from it. I actually embrace the exhaustive Islamic tradition, which includes the Islamic philosophers as well as Sufis as well, in addition to the ones that are considered that go under the 9-foot bridge that Dr. ElMasry constructs. The Quranic vision of salvation is rooted in faith and virtue, not mere propositional belief, this or that doctrine or dogma. And it is not found in salvation is not found in excessive legalism or formalism that our tradition has unfortunately fallen into. It is faith and virtue that matters. Now coming to Dr. ElMasry's thesis, as he put it, belief in the Prophet Muhammad after learning about him is required for salvation. Let me now put forward my counter thesis that I have provided. The Quran unequivocally leaves open the door to salvation to Jews and Christians, not requiring them to convert to Islam, capital I Islam, as the institutionalized religion, nor requiring them to believe in Muhammad as their own prophet, which would have required them to follow Quranic, prophetic, and Islamic law. Instead, these Jews, Christians, and other committed monotheists can continue to follow their own religious scriptures and laws. This is very clear that from the Quran, the verses that I've quoted that say to follow the Torah and the Gospel, and the early historical evidence. At most, what Dr. ElMasry can claim, which is a perfectly acceptable belief, is that they did have to affirm that he was a prophet of God. But as the historical evidence shows, there are plenty of Jews and Christians throughout history who have affirmed that and yet remain Jews and Christians. And there are many good books, such as Envisioning Islam by Michael Penn, that I suggest that you read on this topic. Now, on a more broad level, the Quran considers salvation to be based on individual faith and virtue. And this is a vertical relationship between a person and God, and has little to do with the horizontal relationships, that is to say, what religious community you just happen to be born into, because really that's 90% of the time or more what the case is. Certainly today, we cannot say that belief in the Prophet Muhammad, after merely learning about him, is an essential condition for salvation. Yes, it was true that at that time, there was a split between the early believers and the pagans who were persecuting the believers. At that time, yes, it was important to pick a side. And yes, at that time, the Jews and the Christians who sided with the pagans and the unbelievers were also considered unbelievers by the Quran, just like the believers who sided secretly were also considered unbelievers, and those are the hypocrites. But this does not apply anymore. That situation does not apply, and so the default condition is the standard core charisma of the Quran, which is to believe in God and the last day and to do good deeds. This is what the Quran says salvation is based upon. That is to say, faith and virtue are important for salvation, not mere propositional belief or religious belonging to a particular saved sect. I brought forth many arguments today, including the fact that the word Islam is used differently in the Quran. It is used as an existential state of belief that is in the heart and in the chest and in the soul. It is also used in the sense of primordial monotheism, God's religion. It is not used in the institutionalized sense. This argument was not addressed today by the opposition. As far as my second argument was that yes, in that time, the Jews and the Christians did have to submit socially and politically to the Muhammad and to the believers' community. And we saw this in the Constitution of Medina, in which they were considered one ummah alongside them. At most, one could claim that the Quran requires the Jews and the Christians to accept Muhammad as a prophet to the Arabian Gentiles, to whom he was primarily sent. Most likely, this range of belief would have ranged from viewing him as a just social political ruler, a holy man, an arbiter, that's why he was brought to Medina, to that he was an actual prophet who was sent by God to the Arabian Gentiles. The problem with Dr. ElMasry's viewpoint is the fact that the Quran repeatedly says to follow their scriptures, that is, follow the Torah and the Gospel. This is repeated, and even the verses that he is using to claim that they need to follow the Quran also say that they need to follow, the believers need to follow the Torah and the Gospel and believe in it. Did that kill? Sorry, 1 second. Sorry, can you stop the time? I think I might have. Did that stop the? Okay, keep going. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. Sorry, it was shining on my face. I apologize. The most explicit verse in the Quran on this topic is verse 262 of the Quran, which, far from being abrogated or speaking about past Jews and Christians, is obviously not abrogated or talking about past ones because it's repeated in the last surah of the Quran, Surah 5, which also allows intermarriage, allows you to eat their food, and the surah even ends with Jesus asking for forgiveness for his followers. And then Jesus being promised in another place that his followers will be placed above the idolaters. In fact, to get around these verses, you have to engage in extreme textual acrobatics with multiple conflicting explanations given. The reason why there are multiple conflicting explanations are given is because they are coming with their preconceived theology. It's already predetermined. So now it's about how do we explain this away? And the reason why is because it's felt deep down inside. What happens if we believe this? Our religion will collapse. And we saw this today with Dr. ElMasry's passion, which I do appreciate. So they use different explanations for this, including abrogation, which actually shows that they very much did understand this verse. Now, Dr. ElMasry did not deal with the other evidence that I brought forward, which were multiple verses that condemn religious exclusivism. It condemns those who say that the Jews and Christians say that heaven is just for them, that say, be a Jew and a Christian and you will be rightly guided. This was not addressed at all. The Quran never refers, this is another argument I raised that was not addressed. The Quran never refers to Jews and Christians with the blanket statement that they are kafirs or mushriks. Nowhere does it say that. It only says that some of them disbelieve, and it doesn't even call them ever mushriks. It does say that some of them do commit, they blasphemy, but it doesn't call them with this designation. And then you have to ask yourself, why does the Quran go out of its way to differentiate the people of the book from the idolaters? Clearly, there's something to that. As far as the Quran's critiques of Christianity and the Trinity, these are highly nuanced, and it behooves us to actually ask Christian theologians what they actually believe instead of you're ramming over their theology in this haphazard, unnuanced way. This is how we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be charitable to people of all faiths and try to understand people for what they believe, and this is what the religious pluralists want. Not only this, but the Quran says that the Christians are nearest in affection to the believers. Yes, there are, in that same passage, there are harsh words said against the Jews, but even then it says not all of them are alike, and says that there is a group of followers of Moses who are just and good. The Quran allows marriage and social intercourse. We've already discussed that, which shows again that they were a part of the community. Even the Quran says that you fight on their defense. Later, the Islamic tradition actually goes in the opposite direction and puts prohibitions on Jews and Christians to build churches, to repair churches. Why would the Quran say, on the one hand, fight jihad, risk your life to die in defense of churches and mosques and synagogues, and then later on just say that, yeah, you can't build new ones? I also showed a lot of historical evidence. I showed the Constitution of Medina, which shows it specifically uses the word ummah that says the Jews are one ummah with the believers. There is extensive non-Muslim contemporaneous sources. Why do we use non-Muslim sources? It's not because we think that they're better. No, it's because they're actually contemporaneous to the time that's being described. The reason why we can rely on hadiths and that reinforces our theology is because they were orally transmitted, which allows them to slightly and over time very much mutate and fit the later theology. That's why transmitted texts match up with it, and stuff that's physical doesn't match up with it, including the Quran, which goes back to the Prophet. So we do know that early groups accepted Muhammad as a prophet. Even after the death of the Prophet, we know that Jews and Christians, there were many who accepted. For example, look at the Isawiya, who were a Jewish sect who believed this. So the borders in early Islam were fuzzy. We know this from the history of all religions. It's special pleading to claim otherwise for Islam. The inscriptional archaeological evidence The archaeological evidence shows that early mosques were actually built next to churches, and they shared courtyards, and the early believers actually prayed in churches. We know this from all of the evidence.
Could you wrap it up, because it's hard to believe, but the 10 minutes are up.
Oh, okay. Just one more sentence then, please. Thank you. So I will conclude with this, that what the Quran focuses on is faith and virtue. And what the exclusivists miss is the fact that Islam is not the goal. Capital Islam is not the goal. Institutionalized religion is not the goal. It is a means. It is a means to purifying yourself and reaching a level of God consciousness and purity and good deeds. So that is what I would say, and say that we should strive to be Muslim. We are not just Muslim. Thank you.
Thank you.